Hello everyone. Today I'm going to talk to you about the ownership of English. TESOL as a field is necessarily concerned with teaching, right? It's in the name, teaching English to speakers of other languages. But TESOL is not entirely concerned with pedagogy and, for example, an MA TESOL degree, while it will involve some discussion of teaching, the academic study of teaching and learning, it's not entirely about teaching. TESOL is about more than teaching. One of the topics that TESOL is concerned with has to do with language attitudes, something that sociolinguists of all types will be interested in. In TESOL in particular, what the discussion is about is the attitudes of diverse English users towards their local variety and other varieties of English. That's from two researchers, Li and Cui, and you'll find the references in the description of this video. So they said that TESOL is concerned with the discussion of users of English and their attitudes to their own variety of English and to other varieties. So for example, in my case, you'd be looking at how Canadians feel about Canadian English. Are they proud of it? Are they shy about speaking it with other people? And also looking at how Canadians feel about other varieties of English. Do they think certain varieties are more prestigious or less prestigious? Do they think speakers of certain varieties sound friendlier or less friendly? And so on. That's what's meant by language attitudes. Now, a well-known British linguist named Henry Whittleson used the metaphor of ownership to discuss this phenomenon of attitudes in relation to English in particular. He used the ownership metaphor. He popularized this metaphor in 1993 in a well-known plenary discussion at a TESOL conference and later wrote it up in an article, and that has been something that's been discussed ever since, the ownership of English. And of course you could talk about this in relation to any language, but in TESOL we're particularly concerned with English, of course. And so the discussion that Whittleson started in 1993 continues today. What this is described as, now here's from another author named Wee. I'll read it to you. He said, "The spread of English has led to a question of ownership. Who, it is often asked, owns English? The answer to this question, it is suggested, has implications for a variety of issues, such as what standards of English are acceptable, how it should be taught, and how problems of intelligibility ought to be approached." So three things, right? Standards, teaching, and intelligibility. With regards to standards, some people are concerned with the fact that as English spreads around the world, and as new types of English, new varieties as we call them, appear, perhaps the standards will change and may lead to problems with another one of the points we made with intelligibility, that English could someday become like Latin, where at one point there was a somewhat standard Latin, which eventually split and became multiple languages that you know as the Romance languages, French, Italian, and so on, and that now there really is no Latin, that it's a dead language. Some people worry that that could happen to English. As well, the final question, he said, was questions of teaching. Now this is particularly important to TESOL, right? What English should be taught. Do you teach the local variety of English? If you're in Nigeria, do you teach Nigerian English? Or do you teach a variety of English from outside of your country, right? Should Nigerians be learning British English, American English, right? So those are some of the questions that come up with this metaphor of ownership. Obviously it's a metaphor, no one can literally own the language, but the idea that someone who owns something maintains control over it, right? Gets to choose how it's used, right? You own your various possessions, you get to control them, you get to decide how to use them. Does anyone get to do this with English? Is anyone ultimately in control of the language? it's not so long ago that even in academic discussion of English, and probably still true in public discussions of English, there is a feeling that native speakers own their language. I'm quoting an author named Hook here who wrote that in 2002 in an academic journal called English Today. Native speakers own their language. Another writer, Honey, said that native speakers have to provide quality control over what happens to their language. Again from Hook, a direct quotation, "With English, doors in every field of endeavor stand wide open. Imagine what life is like for those knowing only Lithuanian, Czech, Pushtu, or Turkish." I don't know what it's like to be one of the speakers of only one of those languages, but I can imagine that many of them lead rich, full lives without knowing any English at all. This way of describing English and of its supposed importance in the life of, well, not just Canadians like me, but Lithuanians, Czechs, Pashtuns, and Turks, is often very triumphalist in that sense, right? Often it's portrayed as if something is missing in your life if you don't know English. And as you can imagine, many linguists do not think that's true. Widdowson, with his ownership metaphor, tried to extend the idea of ownership beyond just native speakers of the language, primarily in his case, extending it out to second language speakers of English. Later, it's been extended even more. For now, with Widdowson, what he did was he said, his argument was that English is not a possession which they, native English speakers, lease out to others while still retaining the freehold. Other people actually own it. How did he argue this? Well, he argued it in several ways. The one I'll tell you about now concerns three very interesting words and an interesting argument he made about them. So you have the word postpone, which virtually any highly proficient speaker of English will know. Postpone, to make something later. Right, let's postpone the meeting, let's make it later. Then he pointed out that there's a word like depone, which has similar roots. They've both got pone in them, but they have different prefixes, right? Postpone and depone. Now, if you ask most highly proficient speakers of English what depone means, they probably won't know. Depone is a legal term. It has to do with, if you watch television dramas about lawyers or films, you'll maybe have heard the word deposition. It's related to that, right? To depone the witness is he or she will give a sworn statement in a court of law, right? So, but most of us don't know that term depone, and I only know it because I looked it up after I read Widdowson. If you tell people the word depone and ask them about it, they tend to say things like, "Oh, okay, I didn't know that." But they don't feel stupid for not knowing it. They'll say, "Well, that's a word for the lawyers. I don't need that in my daily life." But the interesting bit is that they will accept that as a real word, a real English word, just one that they don't know. Postpone, depone. Then Widdowson introduces the third one, prepone. Now you can probably guess what prepone means, right? If to postpone a meeting is to make the meeting later in time, to prepone a meeting is to make the meeting earlier in time. This word, however, does not come from the lawyers. This word comes from Indian English. It's a word that's primarily used in India by speakers of English in India. And it's a convenient word, right? Instead of saying, "Let's move the meeting forward to 2 p.m., you can just say, "Let's prepone the meeting to 2 p.m. So it's a convenient word. It quickly makes sense because we all know postpone. And so it's easy to figure out what prepone means. And yet, when people are told this word, when highly proficient and especially native English speakers are told this word, they tend to react in a different way than they do to depone. They tend to feel that depone is a word that they don't know, but it's a real English word. They tend to react negatively to prepone and think that it's not a real English word because it comes from Indian English. Widdowson's argument is that this is completely illogical. The two words have similar etymological roots, right? They come from the same place. The two words are easily understandable, and in fact, prepone is much easier to understand without having it explained to you, because you can just look at postpone and prepone. So, and in many ways, prepone is a more useful word for most of us if we're not lawyers. So there's arguments to be made that prepone is a more useful, more intuitive word than depone, and yet people don't like it. The only reason left, because we've seen it's useful, we've seen it's easy, the only reason that people don't like it is because it comes from Indian English. The root of the word, the origin of the word, seems to be the thing that causes the negative reaction. And Widdowson argues that this is illogical and wastes our time worrying about an origin when we're leaving aside a word that could be perfectly useful. So that's where he bases his ownership argument. He says, Indians are producing new words, useful new words, just like lawyers are. Why is there any reason to not extend that concept of ownership to them? Particularly for TESOL, he wants to talk about the idea of ownership because he says, there's no doubt that native speakers of English are deferred to in our English language teaching profession. What they say is invested with both authenticity and authority. There's something about being a native speaker and supposedly owning the language that gives you an unfair advantage over those who are non-native speakers and supposedly don't own it. And now to clarify, I should say that many Indian people do speak English as a native language. Here in this case, we'd be talking about Indian people who speak English as a second or third and so on language. So, Widdowson started this discussion. It's not to say that other people hadn't talked about this before, but Widdowson popularized the term ownership, and that's the one that's used now. Others have continued to discuss this since and have made further arguments for why we should expand this idea of ownership. The two primary ones, which can be summarized quickly, are the nativization argument and the numerical argument. The nativization argument says when people use a language enough, it becomes theirs, that it becomes nativized, that once the people of a certain area, primarily you could imagine certain countries, once enough of them use the language, it may change to suit their needs. They may introduce new words that are particular to where they are. The accent may change in order to reflect certain first language properties. If their first language has different phonological characteristics, there may be some transfer of phonology. But to say that language is not theirs doesn't make sense, because if we were going to use that argument now, that means that if we were to just back up a couple of hundred years, we'd have to similarly say, well, English doesn't belong to Americans, because when people moved to America from Europe and nativized the English, the same thing happened, right? We look back at the past and we say, well, of course, Americans own English, and of course, Australians own English, and of course, the other native English-speaking countries. Once that's happened in the past, we are accepting of it. To then say that as that happens now, it's not the same process is silly. So the nativization argument, when people use a language enough, it becomes theirs. The numerical argument, when enough people use a language, it becomes theirs. Once we have numbers, sheer numbers, that means something, right? To be discounting of the fact that people from all around the world use English, and many of them within their own country, to talk to other people in their country with whom they don't share a first language. When that's happening a lot, we have to start realizing that it's important and that those people should be extended the same treatment in terms of being researched as proficient users of the language instead of researched as deficient, error-prone users of the language. They should be extended that same treatment as people in native English-speaking countries. The nativization argument, to go back to the first one, is largely summarized in a well-known model of English by a linguist named Cattrew, who had the 3 circles of English model. He drew 3 concentric circles. In the inside one, he wrote inner circle, and he included countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Ireland, Scotland, and a few others. And he called this the inner circle and said that, and here he put countries for whom now English is the main language used in terms of numbers and often has a formal official role, not always, but is a country where you would traditionally think of that's where people speak English. In the outer circle, he included countries like India and Nigeria, where primarily through a colonial history with Britain or sometimes with the United States, as in the case of the Philippines, countries where English is used in a variety of roles. It's not necessarily people's first language, but it's used sometimes officially in the judiciary, often used in education, especially university level education. That's the outer circle. And the final circle is the expanding circle, where we have those countries like China, Russia, Brazil, where English is used primarily in education, primarily for communication with people from outside of the country, usually has very little role within the country in terms of the judiciary or the legal system or anything like it would with the outer circle, with countries like India and Nigeria. This concept of nativization, Widdowson argued that it should be expanded to that outer circle for the reasons I have been giving. Later scholars have argued that we can even extend it to that expanding circle. It doesn't matter if your accent sounds different than mine, it doesn't matter if you use some words differently than I do, that we still have to see that the English you use is legitimate as a source of expression, as a source of communication for you as a member of the expanding circle, as it is for me as a member of the inner circle. Regarding the numerical argument, you can find numerous quotations that explain things about just how many people use English now. The interesting fact is that some people are pointing out that, for example, David Graddle, that an inexorable trend in the use of global English is that fewer interactions now involve a native speaker. That it may be that there are more people speaking English as their second language to each other and to native English speakers than there are native English speakers speaking to each other and to non-native English speakers. That native English speakers are outnumbered in terms of individuals who use the language, but also, as people like Graddle and Seidelhofer have argued, the vast majority of verbal exchanges in English do not involve any native speakers of the language at all. So it's not just that there are more non-native English speakers, but the frequency, the count of interactions is higher than that for native English speakers. So there are simply a lot of people using English, and that has to be a sign that it's important and is thus a thing that should be studied in terms of, in TESOL, in terms of thinking about the importance of English to their lives and the importance of English to the world for people from all 3 of those circles. This idea of ownership matters, right? It matters for non-native English speakers for the reasons that Lionel Wee gave earlier, right? Thinking about standards, thinking about teaching, thinking about intelligibility. It also matters a lot for native English speakers, because native English speakers will have to get used to the idea that the language will change, the language will nativize in different countries around the world, and that the numbers involved will mean that native English speakers may have to change the way they speak to accommodate the sheer weight of numbers of those who are not native English speakers. An example given by Crystal has to do with what are known as interdental fricatives. This is the TH, it's spelt TH and it's pronounced th or the, right? In a word like this or thin, right? Thin, this, right? if you studied English as a second language, you've probably spent a lot of time learning to pronounce those differently, right? Doing things like, you know, the teacher may have had you touch your throat to note the difference, how your throat vibrates when you say thin, but when you say, sorry, I said it backwards. That your throat vibrates when you say this, but when you say thin, it doesn't, right? For the TH, right? You have the th and the. And the teacher may have had you pronounce it over and over, this, thin, thin, thin. And you spend a lot of time trying to differentiate between those two. What happens in practice is that it usually doesn't matter if you even say them at all, in the sense that in Canada, a lot of French Canadians will say something like this one. They won't bother saying this one. If someone says to you, do you want this one or that one, you'll certainly understand it within that bit of text. It doesn't matter that the pronunciation was different than what was taught as standard English in school. Do you want this one or that one? In France, it's often a Z sound, right? Is this one or that one? Within context, we understand those. In Irish English, many people have dispensed with it and use a T, and they'll say 1, 2, 3. And again, you don't have trouble understanding that. If someone says that's you know, we need 3 of them in order to finish this, 3 of them, it's easy to understand, right? So the language changes. Often it doesn't matter that it changes, it's still comprehensible. Another example has to do with uncountable and countable nouns. A word like information in English is an uncountable noun, also known as a mass noun, right? We don't say in standard native speaker English, we don't say, I have 3 informations for you. We say something like, we can say, I have 3 pieces of information for you, or we can say, I have some information for you. Now, this is a grammatical distinction in standard English, standard native speaker English, but it's not a distinction that really matters in terms of comprehension, right? If someone says to you, I have 3 informations for you, you can pretty much guess that they have 3 things they want to tell you, 3 pieces of information. Many non-native speakers of English thus use information as a countable noun. They say, I need 4 information. What's your name? What's your age? And so on, right? I need 4 informations. That's something we're going to have to get used to as native English speakers. Crystal, in fact, predicted that information as a countable noun, that information as a non-countable noun will disappear within 50 years. And he made that prediction in 2008, so we're some less than 40 now, right? So, something to think about, to take away from this, and something to do as a TESOL, someone who's interested in TESOL, is to think about this, right? Who owns English? Is it the native speakers? Is it the native speakers, as might have traditionally been said, something that linguists don't tend to agree with now, but something which a lot of the public still tend to think is true, and that's fine. I'm not saying they're wrong. People can have their own opinions. What I'm telling you about is what the academic discussion in TESOL is with regards to this topic. Who owns English? Is it the native speakers? Is it everyone, like Widdowson said? Others have argued that we should think of it differently. Rajagopalan says, well, we shouldn't really think of ownership, just think that no one owns it, right? Or perhaps you have your own answer to this question that you want to develop in your research in TESOL. Good. Thank you very much for your time.